Hi, everyone. Good morning from Hong Kong and good evening for those joined from the States and Canada. I'm Debin Ma from Hong Kong University Business School. Today, we are so delighted to have economic historian, Professor Debin Ma from Hitotsubashi University Institute of Economic Research and this series. So I think it's very easy to introduce Professor Ma because he has been very actively engaged in the Great Divergence debate on why the Industrial Revolution occurred in England, but not in China or elsewhere. One of the most important and fascinating questions in global or comparative economic history. So today, Professor Ma will be giving a talk titled Involution or Industrialization. Well, we are very honored to have two discussants with us today. The first is Professor Ken Pomerantz, the University Professor of Modern Chinese History and is a college from the University of Chicago. And I assume everyone here knows his very famous and seminal work, The Great Divergence, China, Europe, and the Making of the Modern World Economy. So this book won the John King Fairbank Prize from the AHA and shared the World History Association Book Prize. Another discussion is Professor Osamu Saito, the former director of the Institute of Economic Research of Hitotsubashi University. So as an economic and population historian, Professor Saito has also contributed to a lot of most important debates concerning the Great Divergence debate, but with a focus of Japan. So in 2019, Professor Saito was awarded the Japanese Order of the Sacred Treasure, Gold and Silver Star, in the acknowledgement of his many years of achievement in education, research, and contribution to Japanese academia. Well, their discussion will be moderated by Professor Chiaki Moriguchi, economic historian from Hitotsubashi University Institute of Economic Research. So today is a joint event. Well, our speaker, Professor Debin Ma, will take questions from you, from the audience after the panel discussion. So please feel free to type your question in the Q&A box. And Professor Moriguchi will pick some of them for Professor Ma to answer. So now, without further ado, Professor Debin, the floor is yours. So Professor Ma, please unmute.
Okay. So let me start by sharing the screen. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, good.
Okay. I'm trying to, okay. Well, thanks very much, Chi-Tsun, for the introduction. I just want to start out by saying I have a lot of people to thank for. I mean, this is originally started out as an internal research seminar at the Institute of Economic Research at Hitotsubashi University. And it turned out we are working with Hong Kong U. I think this is, for letting us to use this wonderful forum. I think it's been the most successful forum for economic history, not just Asia, probably all over the world. So I really appreciate also accommodating the format that we have. And then we have these now two very high profile discussions that Chi-Tsun already introduced. So now suddenly this becoming a quite important, at least a publicity event that I'm in some way very grateful. My co-author Kai-Shan is here as well. But let me go and get started with the presentation. We have quite a lot of things to cover, and I'll be certainly happy to pick up questions. One thing I think, as we discussed earlier, I mean, the two discussants, Ken and Osam, they're both really experts in the field. So this is more like really a dialogue to some degree. And feel free if anybody wants to ask them questions as well during the question time regarding this particular topic. So let me, so the topic I have is involution or industrialization. And what we want to do is to bring in the idea of seasonality. And in many ways, involution has, for whatever reason, and this has become a very famous term now inside China, probably not for the reason of agriculture, but for other things as well. Partly the person who made it extremely popular for Chinese agriculture, Philip Huang, is now based in China. So the term is being used for entirely different purpose. And this, we probably have a lot of audience coming from China as well. But let me get started. So we are actually going back to the original, the part that the term originally came from, which is Chinese agriculture. It's not moving. Why is it? Oh, okay, sorry. Okay. Well, it is very one Chinese, the agriculture is the largest sector in China. There's no question about it. It's about 70% of the economy. And this paper that I'm working with Kaishan was quite curious in many ways. It started out with this this volume I'm co-editing with Richard von Glon's Cambridge Economic History China, where I'm doing much more of the modern Chinese economy, which is volume 2. And it turned out we have difficulty finding somebody to write about Chinese agriculture. That's so surprising, given that it's the largest the sector of the economy. And then Ken, who has worked a lot on agriculture, is already writing a chapter for volume 1. So this is a kind of spin-off chapter of that one. And so, which is a good point for me to emphasize, Chinese agriculture is really at the heart of the debate and something that we seem to neglect to study a little bit about. And this relates to the fundamental paradigms about not just Chinese agriculture, Chinese economy in general, because there are a lot of talk about what kind of what is the nature of traditional Chinese economy? Is it fundamentally Malthusian, Smithian? Is it, what is the driving force for modernization? So all of these things really come into agriculture. This is the thing where we really come in. And so I will start with some fundamental features of Chinese agriculture. One thing that came out very quickly, and that has been picked up by so many people, and this is also at the center of the debate, is there's a long-term deterioration in land-labor ratio. China or East Asia in general has probably the smallest farm that you can imagine. I'm always telling people when Westerners visiting China or probably Japan, we were looking at Chinese agriculture to saying this is not agriculture, this is gardening. This is really what people with very intensive cultivation. I'll give you a couple of figures. I mean, I don't think I really need to go into great detail. Philip Huang's article in Journal of Asian Studies put it very clearly that if you compare England with the Lower Yangtze Delta, the acreage per person is about a ratio of 100 to 1. It's really, really striking about how the size of the farm would vary so greatly between these two places. Now I'll give you an example about Japan, and you compare Japan with the whole of Japan with the whole of US. This is coming out of the work of Hayami and Rutan. And again, this is about a ratio of 35 to 1. And the other thing that's very important, which is extremely relevant for what we are going to do here, is that the East Asian agriculture in general is heavily grain and crop-based. The animal husbandry is very, very small. In Japan, it's probably even smaller than 10%. And coupled with that is there's very intensive farm by employment, subsidiary handicrafts production and so on. I mean, certainly the last part is not new, but I think in China and Japan, it's particularly intense with the amount of handicraft sector and household production that was going on there. So this is where we want to start. And the thing that I think we want to make a point about is all these features come into the debate, and this particular paper that I'm working with Paishan and also the slides that I'll be using is partly examining some of the big paradigms that we have. I'll talk about involution, high-level equilibrium trap, which was coined by Mark Alvin, and then, which basically all these arguments are Malthusian. China was in some form of Malthusian trap. And then, of course, you have the relatively more optimistic view, not denying that the very bad land-labor ratio, but putting on certainly a much more optimistic perspective on Chinese agriculture using the work of Boserupian and saying, well, actually agriculture intensification is not necessarily all that bad. With that, come down with commercialization. There's a lot of technical innovation in that as well. So we were, in this particular paper, we want to bring in the agricultural seasonality. And not that but the both schools not recognize that, but I think we really want to bring them in and to a certain degree have a reconciliation on the both sides of the debate. And we also want to seek to clarify some of the theoretical framework. I'm talking about Chinese agriculture, but one thing that's quite good is that we can compare with Japanese modernization for two reasons. Is that after Meiji, Japan had a relatively continuous experience with modernization, much more continuous than China. And the other thing, the Japanese data is far better. So, and the generation of scholars, including some Saito here, has worked on these things. So you have a much better worked out model and stylized facts that we can make that kind of a comparison. Okay, so let me talk about the style facts. One of the things we really emphasize the agricultural seasonality of Chinese agriculture, right? So this is coming out of work actually by Lu Feng, who I think Kai Shan has worked with in Peking University. One striking feature of the geography or the climate of East Asia is the very, very fluctuating rainfall. If you look at this is Western Europe rainfall data, and this is the, I think this is the lower Yangtze. This is the Yangtze rainfall data, and this is the Yellow River rainfall data. And you can see the fluctuation is huge. And this is something very important. It brought very, very high seasonality to Chinese agriculture. And these are the data. You can see that the rainfall is probably much higher on average, but also much greater standard deviation. So this is also already very clear. Just the descriptive statistics showing that. What is the implication of this? And that's really, really important. And that is something that has been picked up, but I don't think has been picked up very systematically. This is what we are trying to explore in this paper. Okay. And this is really very wonderful. These are data coming out of John Buck, who did this massive survey in the 1930s, looking at the harvest idle season period. And you can see this is the index that was constructed throughout 12 months a year. And in January, February, in some places in China, these are the different places in China, there's almost no agricultural work at all, right? And then if treating that as zero, and then suddenly jumped into something like 350, 3.5 times of agricultural work compared to the slack season, okay? And they clearly peaked usually in June and in October. And this is one of the very important features of Chinese agriculture. And we want to show you this particular seasonality factor is much stronger in China and possibly in Japan than in Western Europe and North America. And that is something that is very important for us to understand why the differences in agriculture and the other things that come out of it. Okay. So I'm sure we can get better data. The data was, this is coming out of the work of seasonality of agriculture shipments. So as we know, especially England, this comes out in the debate, in the Great Divergence debate between Ken and Philip Warren and other people, that one thing that was very, very clear, that in England and in the United States, the agriculture was what's called mixed farming, right? You have animal husbandry, in the case of England, animal husbandry probably took about 50% of agricultural value added, whereas in Asia, just less than 10%. You can see that animal husbandry have relatively much less seasonality. Even the grain production in the US, the seasonality is much lower. That's not exactly comparable. This is not labor, but this is more the shipment. So we need to find comparable. One thing that was very seasonal, and this is actually fitting the picture very well, is the cotton production. That's another cash crop. And this is, of course, cotton is only planted in the American South. And I remember this very classic paper by my former supervisor, Robert Gorman, who actually emphasized the American slave economy is extremely diversified in the sense that the slaves were made to do all kinds of handicraft production to supply for themselves. So that point really lends itself very well when you have very strong seasonality. You have periods that is labor has relatively little value, and that's where handicraft sector really came in, and that's the point we want to put in. That's just not true of Asia, but that's also true in the case of the U.S. when it comes to cotton. The slave labor were used for cotton production, of course, but they were also used for doing other kinds of self-sufficient commodities. So this is what we want to do, showing up the style of the facts very clearly. And this is, so we have, and what we want to show now, if you have these very strong harvest season versus idle season, then it will show up in the labor demand, and the labor demand will show up in the wage pattern. And that's exactly what happened. This actually came out when I was working on the real wage paper with Bob Allen and Jan Lawton and John Pascal and other people. Is we look at this data by Sidney Gamble. And in here, he has not just annual average, he actually has these daily, monthly averages and so on. And that was very, very clear. You can see the wages really shoot up in the harvest season. And then it came on in the winter time. It's much smaller. You can see this is sometimes in the range of 2 times or 2 or 3 times, okay? And this is, we plotted against the idle periods, okay? When you have this is very, very idle, and then the wages were very low. And when you're very busy, the wages were very high, okay? And we will show it much more clearly. So this is the same wages. We picked the labor demand in Hebei province because the Gamble data came from very near Beijing. So this is exactly the same area. And you can see that this is the way the labor demand, they should have been in these particular regions that are very clear, April, June, and August, there's a peak season. And you can see the wages seem to correspond, but one thing that's very interesting, the wages were suddenly much higher than zero during the slack season when there's absolutely no work for agricultural labor. So what was popping up the wages? It's probably something else, particularly household and handicraft production. So this is what our point is what was sometimes called involution is really what you see here is taking care of the slack season, slack labor, and reallocating labor across the seasons, okay? And we'll examine what the impact of this is for the whole economy. Now, as I said, we want to compare systematically. We want to show you the harvest is much higher in East Asia than in Western Europe and England. There is a paper by Ken Sokolov and David Dollar many years ago that actually didn't get a lot of attention. I remember I was talking to Ken when at the time. And their point was basically very similar. England had much higher seasonality. And because of seasonality, England tended to have much more home production than the United States. Now, what we try to construct in this paper is looking at the harvest period, the wages, harvest to wages, the ratios harvest to idle period ratios, okay? You can see in United States, England, the ratio is concentrated about 2, okay? Whereas in the China is much bigger. In other words, because of seasonality, the harvest wages tend to be much higher than idle wages. Relatively than in the US, which also, if you're using the Ken Sokolov, David Dollar logic, that means China and Japan will have much higher ratio of handicraft and home production, and that's exactly what we try to argue. Again, that provides another rationale for understanding rather than just using involution. You can see this is really taking care of the slack labor. Okay. Now, I want to show this very quickly. This is I've been working with Wei Peng now at Shanghai Jiao Tong University on this account books. What we found that if you look at business transaction, this is not agriculture, but this is rural transactions, it's very seasonal, okay? Seasonality is an issue that dominates the Chinese economic landscape because China was a larger agrarian country. So this one set data on the amount of silver exchange transactions, and this is the actual volume of transactions. You can see that there's a very strong seasonality. they usually follow the harvest season. Then you can see the transactions shoot up and so on, okay? And not only that, you can see the price of silver dollars actually shoot up during the peak trading season. And this is a really very big issue for the liquidity. So you can see that, this is not in the paper, but you can see that seasonality was very important for understanding Chinese, not just agriculture, but also the economy. Okay. So let me go back to the theory part, which is a little bit messy, and I will try to sort through it. And this is what we do have a model actually worked out, a production function and all of that. But here we will just show in graphs. So what we try to do is here actually put some of the debates into a theoretical structure, and hopefully we can do that. So one of the things that you will see very clearly with the argument of involution is that because there's such higher population relative to land, that the productivity became so low, and it was the subsistence needs that really drove Chinese rural families to lower productive sectors, such as handicraft, okay? They are no longer producing at the optimum anymore. They are just producing to survive, okay? We want to put them into theoretical framework. And you can see the similar argument for high-level equilibrium trap. Whereas if you look at California School and Ken's work, and particularly Boserupian's work, who's worked on agriculture quite a lot, who put a much more rosy picture on that. Wait a minute, there's a lot of technical innovation. It's not true that there's labor surplus. There's actually labor shortage to some degree. And then there's, of course, in the early days, there's on the involution debate was between people like Tom Roski, Lauren Brand, and Raymond Myers, that commercialization actually was improving Chinese agriculture. And we will talk about the modernization experience later on. Here, we will actually draw on some of the Japanese scholars' work on Japan. Okay, this is a little bit messy, but I will try to go through this. So this is a typical production function, this labor force. If you assume land is fixed, right? So this is eventually will run into diminishing return. This is total output, okay? This is the subsistence line, okay? So we see if you have a tendency, a marginal product is parallel to the subsistence line, this is the time where agricultural surplus is maximized, right? So this is point E. Now, we all know your Malthusian economy structure. When you have agricultural surplus, the surplus will induce population growth. The population growth will eventually eat up all the surplus. So this is where the production will be pushed beyond point E until you get to point F, where you see the production average product is meeting the subsistence line. So everything was basically eaten up. Here, the marginal product becomes very low. So if you think about the involution arguments, basically, or the economy, instead of staying at point E, is being pushed at point F, where the whole economy was living close to subsistence. And you have very low productivity here. Marginal product is very low, much lower than point E. Now, they will argue that this particular low productivity is represented by something like handicraft, usually done mostly by women and children, okay? Where this higher, relative higher one is done in the agricultural sector. Because of land constraint, you can't really expand anymore, okay? This is where you have these differential marginal products in these two sectors. And that supports the involution argument that the economy is being pushed beyond optimum and pushed towards the point of subsistence, okay? Now, we want to, and of course, what is the solution? What if you discover more land, which is not the case, but that was the case, for example, in the discovery of the New World, then you open up a new frontier, and then suddenly this production function will shift up, or a total, in that case, you generate more surplus, but that's not possible in China, right? So this is why China completely trapped in this, deteriorating land labor ratio in this point F. And that's important because we want to show this, that most people would argue this is not the path China ever went. But what the California School, other people argue the China-Japan went on slightly different paths, okay? So we go back to this production function again. This is the original one here. So the main point is that instead of a shift up like this, which is not possible in Japan and China because land is already land frontier is already finished. However, you can do what's called labor using technology. The labor using technology goes something like this. When you get to point C, it actually lifts up. So what it says is that once at higher level of labor force, you are actually much more productive. You're producing much higher than this point. But at a lower level, the labor using technology is not very good. And that's something that is close to Boserupian framework, which basically says that when population grows, there's some certain type of technology that actually accommodates these growths that leads to much greater innovation, such as commercialization, such as use of fertilizer and all kinds of things. I can go into, I don't know if I have time to go into these technical details. What I try to show you here is that once you are here, if you don't do anything, you will be going to point B, which is the Malthusian trap, right? However, the Boserupian one actually shifts you to point D, okay? The point D, the marginal product, average product may be lower than the original point A. However, the point D supports a much larger population, much larger output. So even though productivity may be lower, however, the population is much larger. Okay, this is something that's called labor using technology. Okay, I have these things that showing the marginal product, average product. So we want to show that theoretically, that's the case. Now, our key point is we want to show how this particular mechanism works through the seasonality, okay? Because seasonality is quite interesting. We simplify this a little bit. This is marginal revenue. Think about this as wage rate. So in certain harvest season, the wage is very high. And the rest of season, the wage is very low. This is represented by MR2, right? Now, if the farmers were reallocating labor in such a way, they actually smooth out the very sharp edges or sharp seasonality in wage patterns. What they did is they complement with handicraft production, which is not seasonal. In this case, they will actually push up wages in the slack season. They might push down the wages in the harvest season. In both cases, you lead to a squeezing of the wage gap. And not only that, you increase the work days, okay? So in the end, this could be the wages combining these particular both cases. In the end, you have a wage that you see earlier that are relatively much smoother. But the point we really want to argue is because we also have much longer work days in a year, and you have wages, people receiving higher wages in a certain period of time, your total annual income may be increasing. Okay, so if you put it as involution, you will say very simply, well, this is what the optimal marginal product should be, right? And then this is the suboptimal. This is subsistence needs. This is why it's involution. We want to show here what happens is that the involution is taking care of the slack labor. Not only that, they reallocate them in such a way that they actually were able to even out the wage gap, and they were able to lengthen the work days, and they increase the total income, even though they may not increase the average income. And that's something that's really important. That, of course, this is where, if you really follow the debate, is where the argument is that Ken would say this is not involution, this is actually industrial revolution, or some of the Japanese scholars would call industrial revolution, because you push up the work days as well. You increase the total annual household income rather than the daily income. Okay, so I will go through the data relatively quickly. What I want to argue that this actually has huge implications, and this is something that in the process of working through, I began to connect with the other thoughts as well. And for example, there's very famous Lewis model of unlimited supply of labor, that what we argue here is actually, you wouldn't call that unlimited supply of labor. It's actually the surplus labor only in the idle season. In the harvest season, exactly like what Ken or Li Pezheng were arguing, there's a labor shortage. You have to hire labor. And that's just also very important, right? So the agricultural rural by-employment, handicraft sector is much more resilient, because you can't just pay people wages higher than the wages in the slack season, because they also need to work in the busy season. So you have to have annual high income to really induce urban the rule of migration. And that's something that will really come up later on when we see it, okay? So when some people say there's lower productivity handicraft sector, oh, you know, once we have industrialization, these people will come out right away. That's not true, because these workers will stay in the countryside, also taking care of the fact that there's higher harvest season as well. So this is why proto-industry tended to be much rural, and they don't lead to urbanization, certainly in the early phase. They lead to much higher population density and commercializations. So in the case of China, you have market towns rather than these larger urban cities. This is something very, very important when people are using things like urbanization for GDP estimations. Okay, so let me show that as an example. This is something that only clicked to me probably a couple of days ago. This paper by Li Bozong and Yang Laotung. I remember I heard this paper many years ago. I was scratching my head. It didn't seem to make any sense. Now I began to see that it was really making a lot of good sense, and it fits this picture extremely well. This is a paper published in JEH, and Bozong himself has published a very big book estimating the GDP of Hualou, which is the two counties in the Lower Yangtze, two richest counties. The argument he was arguing, this is look at the structure of GDP. This is value-added GDP, right? That's very, very clear comparing with the Netherlands, 1807. I think the Hualou is 1820s or something like that. And you can see these two economies will look very modern, right? The agriculture is only about 30%, Netherlands is 25%. As we know, in the case of whole China, the agricultural share is about 70%. And you could make an argument these sectors are very modern. Now, and that's what they try to make. But then when they go into the different sector productivity, that's where things really become very interesting. And this is the estimation by Li Bozong on the relative labor productivity of different sectors. That was very striking. Agricultural productivity, 100 is the economy-wide average. Agriculture is actually slightly higher than the economy-wide average. Secondary sector, which is mostly proto-industry sector, is less than half, is about half of the agricultural sector, which means that industrial sector productivity, labor productivity is lower than agriculture. Now, I think when he was presenting it, people argued, does that really fit into the involution argument? And Bozong was quite interested. He was very surprised by that. And then, of course, he would argue that that's partly because a lot of labor was conducted by women and children. Now, when you think about seasonality, that all really makes sense because the secondary sector is precisely making use of slack labor, okay? So the agricultural sector productivity was actually quite high. And then when you look at the Netherlands, that's quite different. Netherlands, that's more normal. The industrial sector has twice the productivity of the agricultural sector, and tertiary sector is much higher. And then when you compare the relative labor productivity, Hualou is equal to 100, that's even more striking. Chinese agricultural, the Hualou agricultural productivity was almost the same or even higher than in the Netherlands. Okay, this is labor productivity. This has really come out in the arguments, right? However, when it comes to secondary sector, it's so low compared with the Netherlands. So in that sense, I think it is a very different economy. The Netherlands looked more like a modern economy, where the Chinese, the Hualou is a very different set of economy, although the GDP structure is very similar, okay? Okay, let me get to the final part. I think I have, I think I'm doing okay with time. I want to leave probably more time for the discussion and maybe for the questions as well. And so to a certain degree, what you see here is, you can almost argue both ways. Some people could say, oh, this, if you want to say this is involution, well, if you don't care about terminology, you could say that's the case. But on the other hand, if you want to say, well, this is something really not exactly involution, this is actually rational reallocation of labor and so on, and you could say that as well. However, the real issue is how does modernization really happen? And this is, I think, the work by Osamu Saito, his co-author, recently, and by some of the other Japanese scholars on Japan is very, very interesting. One thing that Saito will show, Professor Saito will show more, is in the initial phase of industrialization, proto-industry, farm bioemployment actually increased rather than decline, okay? The handicraft actually strengthened. It's unlike the story we have modernization came, and then the agricultural sector is shrinking, handicraft is replaced by the modern sector. That's not the case at all. It's actually being strengthened. It was only modern sector really began to grow, then the labor was drawn out. Remember I told you, it's the higher annual income that really matters. It's not just the daily wages that matters. So this is what he called the inverted U curve, that was only in the second part that you could see the agricultural sector, the primary sector labor is really shrinking because the handicrafted sector is slowly being replaced, not completely replaced. And that's the other part that actually makes it, give a very, very nice echo to what Boserupian was doing, that as I will show you later on, or maybe I will just show you by the graphs, is if you look at, this is the data coming out of the LTS data. This is really quite interesting. This is the labor share in the three sectors, okay? Japanese labor share in the primary sector throughout this process remained very, very high, although the value added became very, very low. Okay, the agriculture was contributing smaller share to the economy, where it still kept a large amount of labor. Okay, this gives you the impression the agricultural productivity, labor productivity was very low. But what I think Saito work is trying to do is actually showing, well, that's not exactly true, because a lot of these labor here is actually engaging in proto-industrial work. However, they were not counted in agriculture, they were counted as industry. So we have underestimated the agricultural productivity and overestimated industrial productivity, and getting somewhat distorted picture of this whole major industrialization. Once you reallocate, what you find is really a story that's quite different. Okay, so that shows in even the early Meiji phase is not a big bang story of industrialization. Rather, it's the phase of slowly pulling itself out of the phase of what we call Boserupian growth, and only when the large sector came, which I will show you later on. And this is really quite interesting. This is primary sector share. It's exactly the same data we have seen earlier here. And as I show you, one of the things that happens when the urban industrial sector productivity continue to increase, particularly the capital labor ratio increase, wages began to increase. That's when the agricultural, the primary sector labor input will really begin to shrink. So you can see this is the wage ratio of urban to rural wages. This is male wages, we can talk about it. Female ratio didn't change. Only when it began to really rise, you can see the agricultural rural migration began to change. In the beginning, the industry actually stayed in the agricultural sector, and they stayed almost with the primary sector as well. So that is really showing, we are, I don't think I will go and talk about, we are constructing a model to show this particular process, that showing that this inverted U could be indicated by a model that shows that this particular inverted U is coming up. Okay. So let me go into the implications. I'm getting towards the end of it. We have a lot of examples in China. This is something I should certainly go into. When you look at 1930s, this is a line we found recently by Fang Xianting. For those who work on the Chinese economic history, knows his work very well. He's one of the founders of the Nankai Institute of Economics. And one thing he said, well, why is small-scale industry in China so prevalent than Western industrialized country? It was very, very clear because they take advantage of idle agricultural labor because of the seasonality in Chinese agriculture. Okay, so he observed that firsthand that was the case. Now, not understanding that, we actually have, this is where I think the other side of the involution debate, I think probably Ken and other people can get into that debate a lot more. For example, in the 1950s, there's this massive industrialization, thinking handicraft sector was completely backward. We need to eliminate them. And that, of course, we know that's part of the reason that contributed to Great Leap Famine and Great Leap Forward. And this is a lesson that we still learned. And if you look at 1980s, 1990s, the industrialization in China really started in the rural sector. That really showed this factor comes out very strongly as well. Okay, this is a very quick conclusion, and I don't think I need to go into that. And thank you very much. I'm done. So I will hand over to the chair and to the discussants. Should I?
Thank you,
Debin.
Professor Ma.
Yeah, I should stop sharing, right?
Yeah, let's welcome Professor Chiaki to moderate the discussion.
Okay.
Great. Oh, thank you, Debin. Now we are going to have a first discussant, Professor Ken Pomeranz, please.
Okay. Thank you very much. This is a lot of fun. This is a very interesting paper, which formalizes and synthesizes a set of ideas, many of which have been floating around for quite some time, but not in quite this form. I think the fundamental point that what the California school called Smithian growth could have easily been called Boserupian growth, which is something that Lars Emil Nebo-Nissen pointed out in his 2019 dissertation, is quite right. The markets that allowed densely populated places to turn some of their labor into imported goods from elsewhere are the necessary complement to the development of labor-absorbing technologies that allow that labor to continue producing without needing much more access to land, and vice versa. So in this case, at least, Smith implies Boserup and Boserup implies Smith. And the seasonality of agriculture is indeed crucial here, creating a problem of temporary seasonal unemployment, or underemployment really, that looms as a potential problem for all intensive agricultural systems, but gets addressed in a number of different ways that depend on specific settings. Multi-cropping in some cases, handicrafts in others, animal husbandry and still others, off-season work to clear forests or develop irrigation systems that expand next year's agricultural possibilities, which is really what drives that Sokolov dollar paper that Debin alluded to about North America, and so on. In late imperial and 20th century China, where neither animal husbandry nor the clearance of additional land was possible on a sufficiently large scale to make a difference, this clearly meant that the continued expansion of multi-cropping, still possible in some places, and the extension of handicrafts were going to be the big story. And grounding the particularly sharp seasonality of agriculture, and thus of opportunity costs for labor, in the particularly strong seasonality of rainfall over much of China, at least when compared to Europe, makes a lot of sense. In particular, it's important for the way in which it reconciles the idea of an unusually labor-intensive kind of agriculture, as suggested by man-land ratios, and which in turn often suggests to people a Malthusian framework of analysis, with the estimates by people like Li Bozhong, Bob Allen, myself, and others, that both the average and the marginal productivity of a day of labor in at least the rice-growing Lower Yangtze actually compared quite well to agricultural labor productivity anywhere in the world, even as late as the turn of the 19th century. The problem was that this high productivity activity absorbed a surprisingly small number of labor days per year. The question then becomes, what do you do the rest of the year? What mattered to drawing people out of the countryside then was not, as this is a point Debin just made rather nicely, was not whether urban wages were above M2, the off-season wage rate, but whether they were above L1, M1, plus L2, M2 over L1 plus L2. So in other words, whether they were above the average of agricultural season and off-season wages. And that figure could be considerably higher, had to be considerably higher than the off-season wage rate. As long as urban wages weren't higher than that weighted average figure, there was no reason for people to go to the city unless they had prospects for something better than unskilled wages on the one hand, or were displaced from agriculture by eviction on the one hand, which was relatively rare given Chinese property rights regimes, or by disasters that made access to land at least temporarily useless on the other hand. And we see this verified, for instance, by looking at who actually did go to cities and for what jobs. So for instance, the fact that people from the Yangtze Delta, though they lived adjacent to Shanghai and dominated many of its skilled manual jobs, did not generally move to take low-end unskilled jobs in Shanghai, which instead filled up with people from poorer, disaster-stricken places like Subei. To give just one striking example, in the 1930s, less than 1% of Shanghai rickshaw pullers came from Jiangnan, came from the surrounding countryside. And yet, rickshaw pulling, as badly paid as it was, did pay better than the off-season wage in the countryside. What building in seasonality also makes sense of the fact that you could have extremely low off-season wages, but also have people spending money on labor-saving innovations, such as bean cake fertilizer, which was a major point of contention in my argument with Philip Wong a number of years ago, as long as what they were saving was agricultural season labor. Indeed, the pattern that we see in some surveys of the more commercialized parts of early 20th century North China, in which handicraft income is strongly correlated with the use of purchased bean cake fertilizer, makes perfect sense. Rather than being in any way involutionary, the extension of handicraft production in the off-season to finance bean cake is essentially a form of arbitrage. You're spending off-season time to save more valuable agricultural season time. So it's all quite rational, but it is constrained by the availability of markets for your handicrafts. And that, I think, is a big story that we need to think about. What are the limits on those markets? In terms of some of the arguments about the so-called Great Divergence debate, what I think Debin does here, among other things, is he, on the one hand, confirms skepticism about simply using real wages as a measure of living standards. Again, it's the average, the weighted average of real wages times the amount of labor spent in each kind of work that we should be comparing. Though we can still use the real wage to compare productivity in particular activities. On the other hand, it also suggests the limitations of using agricultural incomes per labor day to assess the relative health of the rural economy or the living standards of farmers, as both Li Bozhong and I have done at certain points, and as we probably shouldn't have done. That tells you about agriculture, but agriculture is only part of the story. That figure too is good for understanding productivity in a particular sector, but what we really want are annual figures for comparisons of living standards, which is what Bob Allen did in his England Yangtze Delta article. So a few thoughts now, having said that basically I agree with the thrust of the paper, a few thoughts about possible additions or revisions. First, it would be really interesting to eventually look at Guangdong, since its rather different agricultural seasonality. This is a place where you could not only double, but in fact triple crop, might yield interesting intra-Chinese comparisons. Second, there's something interesting going on in figure 4 that I don't fully understand and that may be worth exploring. Figure 4 is the one where you have Buck's seasonality data with Gamble's wage rate data by month. And while the basic inverse relationship between the percentage of idle time in a given month and wage levels looks quite robust, there are a couple of anomalies at the beginning and end of the agricultural season that are interesting. March idle time is already under 5%, and April idle time is actually the lowest of the whole year. It looks like about 2% eyeballing it. Unfortunately, I don't have access to the volumes because my library is closed for COVID, so I couldn't check, but that's what it looks like from the graph. And yet March wages are less than half of peak levels, and April wages less than 2/3. There's a similar oddity at the end of the agricultural year, where wages drop precipitously in September and October, though September idle time is still near the lowest levels of the entire year, and October idle time, though it has gone up, is still pretty low. Now, one possibility is that these are simply reporting problems, but another, which is quite intriguing, I think, is that they indicate an extension of the work year between the time when the wage numbers were generated, which was the first half of the 19th century, and when the labor time data were recorded, which is in the 1930s. If that's indeed what's happening, it would confirm that the basic dynamic that the paper describes was in fact continuing to operate, that you were continuing to find ways to more opportunities for off-season labor, even in a relatively poor and non-commercialized province like Hebei. Though of course it is Hebei relatively close to Beijing, so that's a bit of a problem. But if that's not the explanation, then I think it would suggest that we are somehow dealing not with 2 seasons, but with 3. Agricultural peak season, agricultural moderate season, and non-agricultural. And that would be quite counterintuitive, because agricultural wages should be highest of all during the hectic planting and harvesting periods, which the paper rightly notes were quite compressed in China, rather than in midsummer. So my money, at least, is on the other possibility, that what you're seeing is further extension of by-employments, even in a relatively non-commercialized and poor region. And that's important because it means that you were not yet at the Malthusian limit at which this would turn into involution in Philip Huang's sense, even in the 1930s on the North China Plain. And if you're not there yet on the North China Plain in the 1930s, it's hard to see when you were there. Well, except maybe in the Maoist period, when you deliberately shut off handicraft possibilities. Third, the paper, I think, largely sidesteps the issue of gendered labor, which has been a big deal in earlier versions of this debate. And I see the way in which substituting the off-season, on-season binary for the male-female one is in some ways nice and clean and clarifying. But at the same time, it does seem to me that at some point, we do have to deal with the fact that an awful lot of this handicraft labor is female, and that the marginal productivity of female labor in most agricultural tasks is significantly lower than that for males. And it seems pretty simple to build this in conceptually, right? You would just have an L1 and M1 male, and an L2 and M2, and an L1 and M1 female, with less difference between M1 and M2 for women than for men. Though what's conceptually easy might be empirically quite difficult, because you'll have to find data to plug in for all of this. But doing so, it seems to me, would be quite worthwhile. If in fact returns to female labor were genuinely less seasonal than for male labor, because female labor was less productive in various agricultural tasks, requiring upper body strength, long hours standing up, etc., and perhaps was actually more productive in, say, weaving, given acquired skill, learning by doing. And much of the extension of total family time, at least in the textile zones, was indeed an extension of female labor time. That would further clarify the ways in which this Boserupian model differs from an involutionary one, while perhaps strengthening the arguments for something that the paper introduced very briefly near the end, which are comparisons to either the Japanese or the European version of the Industrious Revolution model, those two being somewhat different despite the shared name. And this, I think, would be especially true given the increased availability by the early 20th century of some goods for purchase, kerosene lamps, matches, machine-spun yarn, that did in fact save time on domestic tasks, which is a very important component of the Industrious Revolution model, right? That you're generating additional income through more and more specialized work, and you're making it possible to do more work for the market, in part by purchasing things that you used to have to produce for self-consumption. Finally, where I wonder most about the paper, oddly enough, is really in the headline framing, which is the idea that it's reconciling the notion of involution with the position taken by the so-called California school, or that the issue, as the title seems to suggest, is involution or industrialization. And here I think it's important to remember that, with the possible exception of Gunder Frank, the California school never claimed that the process of either Smithian or Boserupian growth was leading to industrialization. Instead, there was a very strong emphasis on the discontinuity between that kind of growth and modern growth, and to claim that being relatively successful at one of them didn't necessarily tell you much about prospects for the other. In that sense, then the California school was always at least potentially broadly consistent with Elvin's position, though perhaps not with an extreme version of it, in which there was no surplus above subsistence being produced anymore. And I don't think that either Elvin or any of the California school people would say that that theoretically possible point at which all surplus has vanished had been reached in reality. What distinguished Huang's version of involution, I think, was the idea that the marginal returns to additional labor-absorbing innovations not only were at subsistence levels, but had been there for centuries by the time we got to the late Qing. And the connected idea that this involutionary growth, therefore, not only didn't lead to industrialization, but constituted a barrier to it, because nascent industry couldn't compete with rural handicraft producers who were willing to accept subsistence returns. And I don't see anything in this paper that would help back up either of those claims. To be sure, a sharp difference between agricultural season and off-season wages suggests that certain kinds of industry with lots of fixed capital might not make sense if they could only compete for labor during part of the year. So you would stick with less capital intensive and perhaps less productive equipment that you used part of the year, right? But plenty of early mechanization wasn't all that capital intensive and was competitive once introduced in China, as Debin knows well from some of his early work on silk filatures. Moreover, there are many examples of factories, not only in East Asia, but all over the world, that did in fact shut down for harvest season and still thrive. I mean, in France, that was the case all the way down to World War I for many industries. And in fact, one would think that such a factory might have faced less disruption from the very concentrated harvest and planting seasons that this paper points to in China than from the 2 to 3 month long harvest season that you found in parts of Europe. Especially if said factory mostly used female labor, which does seem to have been in high demand in agriculture only at peak planting and harvesting times, and not during the summer months when the crops are growing. The Japanese story, alluded to near the end of the paper, in which mechanized industry began to outcompete some handicrafts, causing rural industry to start going down the right side of that inverted U, well before there was significant exit from agriculture. Indeed, agricultural labor days rose sharply in the Meiji period. Plus the labor experience of Taiwan seems to me pretty strong evidence that while Boserupian / Smithian growth wasn't leading to industrialization, it also wasn't a barrier to it, except perhaps in a few places where agricultural intensification progressed to a point of ecological crisis. And that would be mostly in the uplands in the Southwest, or maybe parts of the Northwest. But the paper is certainly right, and I think also certainly consonant with what people like Bojong and myself argued, in saying that the transition to modern growth had to begin outside the rural sector, right? The rural sector may not have inhibited the possibilities for industrialization, but it also wasn't generating it. And I think this paper does a really good job of helping us formalize our understanding of what that outside push had to look like. And there's more to say, but I will stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Ken Pomeranz. Now we are going to have a second discussion. Professor Osamu Saito. Slide show. A little bit on the right.
On the right?
Yeah. 6番目ぐらいの
Can't find.
ファイルからずっと右の方に移動していただいて、一番上のオレンジ色のところにタブがいくつかあって、今ホームですけど、もう少し右側にスライドショーがあります。
Oh, yes.
はい、はい。
Oh, yes. Sorry.
はい。
Okay, from the start. Right. Just like my fellow discussant, I also like the paper very much. Particularly, I very much like the Debin's bringing Boserup back into this long-standing debate. What I'd like, by way of commenting the paper, what I'd like to do is simply three things. One is to look a closer look at the Boserupian approach, and I will bring a sort of new, a new one, that is the so-called Ishikawa curve, and I'll have a second look at my own by employment curve, and then I'll pose a couple of just questions to the authors. So the Boserupian approach. I think the point of the Boserupian approach is the sort of relationship between population growth and agricultural intensification. The point is that it's agricultural intensification, which is defined as a gradual change towards patterns of land use, which make it possible to crop a given area of land more frequently than before. This, I think, is a broader definition, broader than the usual definition, which covers only the additional labor per hectare of cropped land. I think when we discuss the shift of production function, like figure 7 of this paper, what we do is simply to fix the amount of land or capital or both. In the Boserupian model, I think the land is a variable. Although the total acreage may be already fixed, but by having a different systems of land use, we can change the input from land. sorry. So that the ways in which land is used evolves as population increases. The sequence of agriculture, the Boserup put forward, is starting with the shortening of fallow, and followed by the spread of annual cropping. By annual cropping, I mean it's not a sort of a continuous working in the fields throughout the 12-month period. We need probably a short the idle season, but still it's different from the having a fallow. So that's the point. And then by the rise of the multiple cropping, I think much of China in the 18th century is already in the stage of annual cropping. Parts of the South must have seen 2 or even 3 successive crops, the same plot every year. This brings me to the sort of second issue that is associated with what we call Ishikawa curve. This is a curve Ishikawa put forward. Shigeru Ishikawa was a development economist working on Asian countries. He in the 1970s, wrote a sort of issues paper for a ILO, a SCAP sort of consortium, arguing that labor release is not crucially important for the developing countries. It is labor absorption the agriculture should sort of perform in the early stage of industrialization. If you look at the Boserupian intensification, it's accompanied by an increase in hours worked in agriculture. I think Ishikawa paid much attention to this side of the argument. He proposed, or he actually he put forward 2 diagrams. One is quoted very often. That is the Mark 1, which shows that here is the labor input and here's the output. It increases with, the output is increasing with labor input. So it's very much a labor intensive way of producing agricultural output. But at point L, it goes this way, which actually means bringing in some labor savings of the devices. However, what is really important for us here is his second diagram, which shows, this is again the labor input in rice cultivation, but here we have the total input of labor, the whole household labor. Here again, we have the same, KL portion of the graph. The total input of labor increases with labor input in rice cultivation. But at the same point L, from now on, we have a sort of a second crop coming in. So that although probably some sort of a new technology coming in to rice cultivation, but the second crop cultivation absorbs more labor. So the total labor input still keeps going up at point M. Then we go into sort of different phase, so that now we can use less labor to produce probably more. And I think this second portion is really important for us here to have a close look at the issues discussed. I think it is version 2 that can be more important for us, particularly historians, since it shows first why agricultural intensity tends to keep labor on land. And second, allows us to focus on historical phases in which multi-cropping and by-employment became important. So that I think we have to have a look at the multi-cropping and by-employment. I think what is really important for us is that what comes in as a second crop, it can be a subsistence crop, it can be an industrial crop, used as material for industrial production, or livestock, cattle grazing, or silkworms raising. These are sort of options. Neither cash cropping nor mixed farming is considered dually occupied. But is sericulture a by-employment? In Tokugawa, Japan, both silkworm raising and silk reading described as farm family by-employment. But I'm currently doing a sort of project on occupational structure. We do not consider the silk as a family, silkworm raising as a family by-employment, because both are in the same agricultural sector. But the point is that the cash cropping, sericulture, and the silk reading, and even the weaving are on the same continuum, the same sort of trajectory. So that's a point that we have to discuss both multi-cropping and by-employment, which have something to do with the debate between the Smith and Gross versus involution. The point is, if intersectoral input-output relation at work, in the case of Smith and Gross, intersectoral division of labor leads to the economy-wide per capita growth. In involution, which actually means introduction of another subsistence crop, perhaps, so unlikely to lead per capita growth. So now the by-employment. Debin referred to the diagram I drew between the by-employment and the level of economic development. Here we have a diagram from Toki Seasonality wrote for as a sort of a discussion paper. We have a pool district level data from two prefectures, one in 1879 and the one is 1925. I just used the pooled data. Here we have on the horizontal line, we have the primary sector share in the labor force in this case. So the history starts from the right hand. The by-employment rate goes up as economic the development proceeds, but peaks somewhere here, then goes down. It's an inverse U-shaped, but I think it is important to realize that the peak is where the primary sector share was around 70%. Maybe this percentage varies from case to case, but in the case of Japan, it's 70%. So I think this size, I think, of non-primary sector suggests that the size of the non-primary sector really matters. The implication is that in order to get out of involution, what the by-employment curve suggested is that the level of a primary sector growth matters. What Ishikawa exhibits is that agricultural growth was also important, whether it was in the LM phase, the first phase, or still in the second phase, or still in the first phase. which must have affected the shape of the seasonality index. So that is the point of my question. The question is framed in this way. Suppose that there were the three major regions in pre-1949 China, the North and the South, but South may be divided into two. S1 represents the southern provinces without double cropping, and S2 for southern provinces with double cropping. Incidentally, Ken said that this paper, what is the lacking in this paper is the attention to female labor. I came across a table in the Esther Boserup's book. It's not the condition of agriculture, it's something different. But the paper is on female farming systems, in which she divided China into three regions and look at the female hours worked as a percentage of the total labor force required. It goes with this order. The female intensive is in S2, whereas in the North, not much female labor is used. So is the level of the primary sector share higher in the order like this? The primary sector is highest in the North, whereas in S2 regions, it's the lowest. Is it the case? Does the seasonality, and again, this is really the question, does the seasonality index behave in much the same manner across three regions? Maybe that is a sort of a kind of a testing for your seasonality hypothesis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Osamu Saito. So now I would like to take probably 5 minutes for Debin to respond to two discussions.
Okay. Sure.
Yes.
And also, I think my co-author Kai-Shang is there. If he wants to add in, feel free to jump in. If it's okay, I mean, those are, first of all, I just want to say wonderful comments. And they are also so kind. So, and let me just sort of, I may not need all the 5 minutes, I think, but let me add a couple points. First on the title, I do think Ken was completely right. The title was a bit of a misnomer. I think I got so fascinated by the rhyming part of it, involution, industrialization. So that was a mistake I probably made. I think you are, let me sort of answer the question in reverse order. I think you are completely right. I think on this aspect, you know, we might have different opinions about whatever the whole involution, Malthusian, but on this one particular question that's really very important, that I think the involution argument was probably most fatally wrong, was that they regard this labor using technology or whatever as impediment to industrialization. That's where the problem really is. The only way they think that China was out of it is that the first figure is the increase of land. They didn't think about the Boserupian part of it. And I could see that is something, if you look at the whole, I think this is something we talked about before, when China industrialized, this belief in the large farm market, mechanized industry, and all these things, that's the way we should be going. And that was what's actually causing the problem. I think, in fact, it was showing the reverse, right? You could see the labor, this is what getting to Osam's point, labor absorption went a long way. You know, the whole handicraft production, and even you were saying, even early phase of mechanization, the harvesting season. I mean, look at the silk industry. Even in Shanghai, they basically closed down the machines when the season was gone. So that you can really, you know, plod along for really a long time. I think that's a really point, very well taken. No, I really want to thank both discussants. I think, you know, let's say, Ken, I think what really impressed me is it added so much rich stories about these reallocation across seasons, not just in terms of production, but also in terms of marketing, right? The soybean and how you save it. You actually do want to save labor for the harvesting work. And that's really what you see happening. That is really, really going on. I think the point you talk about I think it was figure 4, I don't have it right now. It's very well taken. I need to, both Kaishan and I need to take a quick look, or need to look at it. I think the gamble wage is for the 19th century, you're right. And the other one is from the 1930s. So there might have been changes that were going on. But if they were consistent, that's also echoing a little bit your point, that you could see even in the later days, the same forces were at work as well. The buck data itself has a lot of seasonality, so we should make use of that. We shouldn't just be using, I think when we did the other one, comparing, we used the annual wages and so on, but that particular gamble data was quite wonderful that it showed these annual, but that was only one series. That's only coming out of one fuel store, so that's where part of the problem is. I think the point about gender raised by both Ken and Osama are wonderful. I think that's exactly correct. Agricultural, the very heavy farm labor were usually done by the male. So the seasonality issue is actually also a male-female. It's not exactly like that, but it is part of that as well. But you can see in a graph I have for the Japanese wages, the wage differences, urban rural wage differences for the male began to diverge in the beginning, but not for the female. That really went up. So that's actually echoing the part of the story. I think the regional variation, Ken pointed out, I think Osam pointed out in much greater detail, was very well taken. I should probably go and talk with Kaishan a bit more. Multiple cropping and looking at other provinces. I mean, the problem with multiple cropping, the problem didn't solve. Yes, it does give you more seasons, but the harvesting is very demanding. So that's different from handicraft. Handicraft doesn't have that kind of harvesting, 2 or 3 weeks, everything has to be done. Even with sericulture, you have to raise them in that particular period. So I think those things that we can definitely look into that. They are really very, very good point. I don't think I think Osam picked up a lot of very good points, very rich points. I think the point about Ishikawa curve and labor absorption exactly echoes that. The final point I think Osam made very well, the distinction between involution and smithing growth, is the smithing growth is emphasizing this intersectoral reallocation labor, which actually allowed productivity growth. And that's not really an involution picture. That's really quite important. I think what we are talking about here is the smithing growth, not just the intersectoral, is also intertemporal reallocation labor as well. So I think this is what the seasonality thing that really adds into it. I think that's maybe how much I want to say. I don't know if Kaishan has anything to add, or you think we should go into questions? I don't know how much.
Kaishan, do you want to also show your face?
Okay.
Hi.
Thank you. I learned much from the comments. I have one point to say that I agree with Professor Ken Pomeranz that we emphasize on the discontinuity between smithing growth and industrialization. I think this point is very important. And I have no more to say. Thank you.
So from the floor, we have several questions, and I think I'm going to probably choose 3 questions in the rest of the 10 minutes. And I also want to welcome Professor Debin Ma and Professor Ziwu Chen to join us for the Q&A sessions. If possible, please. Okay, so the first question from Jed Kaplan. How much, this is the first one on the Q&A, how much of the high cost of growing season labor in China relative to Europe and US is also related to the high labor intensity of the agriculture system, such as wet rice needs much more labor to cultivate than cereals, and also continuous cultivation of small, highly productive fields require much more labor to sustain, such as manuring and weeding. And I want to also kind of add to this question. So how much is seasonality is exogenous? Is this like a weather and the type of crop is determining the seasonality, or can many people do something about that?
That's a really good question. I wish maybe I'll talk more with Kaishan. Maybe he can help me out in another occasion. That's something I wondered as well. So when we start out, we look at the rainfall data, and this is the monsoon Asia. And I think maybe, I don't know, Ken and Osam, feel free to jump in on that question as well. I think that's really, and especially your question about whether it's endogenous or exogenous is quite important. So you would say the rainfall data is probably quite important. It maybe makes it different from Europe to a certain degree. And I think the paper by Lu Feng, which we cited in the beginning, and how much this rainfall and leading to seasonality, and how much this seasonality leading to very small scale farming. And that's really quite interesting. And it's something I didn't think about. I mean, all these things are in one sense connected. It's very difficult to have very large size farm, even if you have all the mechanized technology, when you have these very intensive seasonal harvesting demand, labor demand. I don't know how, I don't know if anyone, the two discussants or Kaisha have anything about whether that's endogenous or exogenous on that. It's completely specific to Asia. And I think there is people who study long-term climate change. And I think Mark Alvin and others, and also some Japanese scholars study the long-term climate change, who's showing how Chinese agriculture over time changed the way they cultivate. I was quite interested in political economy, and I began to understand how the Chinese rulers like agriculture much more than commerce, because agriculture they can control very well. They have this intensive farming. So it's, in that sense, it's not entirely exogenous, but I think that's a little bit on the other side. But that's a good question that I could not answer right now. But. I don't know if other people want. Ken, do you have an idea whether that's exogenous or endogenous? Or you have to, okay.
I doubt that it's entirely exogenous, but the fact of the monsoon is a real fact, right? I mean, Chinese rainfall is heavily concentrated in roughly 4 months. Now, it is also true that, with storage tanks and so forth, you can extend the agricultural growing season. I mean, that's part of what happens with a lot of the labor-intensive projects in North China in the 50s and 60s. Right? Basically, you were able to grow winter wheat and get around the fact that the winter is so dry. And some of that should have been physically possible even prior to the 1950s. You'd have to look pretty carefully at why it doesn't happen on a larger scale. So there's clearly, not all of it is exogenous, but a significant part of it is.
Maybe one way we could look at it, I mean, I will just be brief here, since both of you mentioned this whole regional variation. I mean, if you look at certain areas of China where animal husbandry was quite actually predominant. So that we will see a very different pattern, but maybe it's so drastically different that it's really hard to compare. Anyway, thanks, Ken, for it.
Okay, yeah. For the second question, I would like to take Professor Ziwi Chen's question, and since he's here, I would like him to actually raise this question, please.
Yeah, I was just addressing the difference between output or grain output seasonality and the livelihood risk aspect, because on the one hand, it is great to point out the impact of risk or seasonality risk on the people's livelihood, because the risk dimension has often been ignored in the existing literature on Malthusian population growth, as well as in the Great Divergence debate. So you guys are pointing this out. But on the other hand, I think the wage seasonality and the output seasonality are actually two different aspects. The wage dimension, I mean, the wage seasonality, it reflects more on the livelihood risk that the farmers actually face. So in other words, the output seasonality can be very high. But if the farmers have a way to hedge the seasonality risks related to output, then the output seasonality risk is not really a problem or does not present a real challenge to the farmers. So I would have designed the research in a somewhat different way. So I'm just curious whether you guys have given a lot of thought about how to ultimately measure how well the Chinese farmers in history have tried to mitigate seasonality risks and other risks so that the output risk can be high, but still the effect on people's livelihood was not such a big deal.
Thanks. Well, you can tell Zhu is a finance professor, so yeah, no, no, that's really a very good question. I think the output seasonality is quite important because it's quite well known. There are several ways of trying to hedging the risk. One is storage, right? So there's the warehousing that China was famous for. People have written about it. Pierre and Tim Will has written about how the government has been using the storage warehouse to do that. The other is probably trade, right? So if one place is short of food and they can import from other places, I think in heavily the areas with very good transport places, the storage actually tend to be quite low. So that was one of the ways of relieving them. I think your point about wage seasonality or income seasonality is actually quite relevant because those things are. I showed a little bit. This probably goes beyond that. I think other people, Carol Shu recently have done this paper using prices because you can see the grain prices have very strong seasonality as well. So they're using that to capture interest rates as a way of looking at them. You can see the seasonality really affects interest rates, price of money, and all the other things. One of the things that happen over time is precisely all these new financial instruments or monetary instruments that have come out to reduce the impact of seasonality. For example, when paper money was becoming more prevalent, you could see the seasonality of the silver dollar was beginning to be reduced as well. Much better clearing mechanism that came out. So that, I think, in essence, is very relevant.
Yeah, this is why last week, we presented our work on the impact, the effect of the Confucian clan and other Confucian innovations, because to a large extent, those Confucian innovations were really to deal with, were designed to a large extent to deal with the kind of seasonality and other types of survival risk. So if those innovations had done a good job in mitigating risks, then the output seasonality may not have amounted so much to limiting population growth and other types of welfare improvement for the larger Chinese society. Yeah, thank you.
So I'm looking at Jackie, which question do you want me to answer? I mean, I think we're going to have all the questions. So even if those we can't get to, we will be able to read them and they'll be very useful.
Right. Two questions are related to broader themes. So I would like to know how you think about it. So is the seasonality also affects more social relations or religion or social norms, or even this family system that, so any thoughts on these broader?
I see. I should have probably come to Zuru's talk last time about bringing culture and so on. I would imagine that this is going. I think I encountered this whole seasonality issue when I was working on finance side of things. And I was so surprised by the commercial transactions. And when I was doing this, I think when Kaisha and I were working on for the Cambridge chapter, we began to really encounter that. We suddenly realized this is something that is extremely. So I haven't sourced through the whole social implications, but we all know that the lunar calendar is a very big deal, right? If you look at people are so aware of the weather, people are so careful about how the harvesting seasons and these things, every day people will pray. Yes, I completely agree. I don't know if there's anything I can add to that, except I'm sure that has a very strong impact culturally and psychologically in that sense.
I'm asking this partly because in a Japanese history, that this family farm is strongly associated with this primogenitor of the Japanese system, that you tend to have this small land passed down for generations, and it's still today, it's a barrier to have this large scale farming. But I guess that doesn't apply to China.
Well, there's a lot of regional variation. I think probably Zhu and Qi-Chun will know a lot more about it. In the South, lineage was very strong. So yes, you have small scale farming, but you do have families owning large plots of land, but they are cultivated individually. And that, of course, would have, in China, primogeniture was not as widely practiced, partly because the lineage system goes beyond the individual family to a certain degree. So I think in Japan, lineage was also, well, Osamu will be the expert on this. I mean, lineage was probably quite important, but probably not as prevalent, right? The stem family was much more important, if I understand that correctly. So maybe that's one way of thinking the differences. Again, anyone else have anything to add, please come in. People on the panel list. Or do you want me to go to other questions?
I think it's about time for us to close this seminar. Any last words from discussants? Okay,
well, thank you very much, Kiaki and Debin, for the wonderful hosting and also the wonderful presentation. Of course, our two discussants, Ken and Osamu, also contributed to this joint event. As many of our participants know, this is actually the first time or the second time we're doing a joint webinar event with another institution. So this time we want to thank the University of the Hitotsubashi University in Japan for doing this event. I've noticed today for the first time we have many participants from Japan. So I guess this will probably, I hope this means that going forward, our future webinar events will have much more participation from Japan. Of course, in the past we tried, but we never succeeded in achieving our goal. But as I mentioned earlier, this whole sequence of the webinar events has been focusing on more quantitative approaches to historical research, even though we don't exclude other types of historical research. We try to bring the two, or at least multiple approaches together. So we'll continue to make this effort. As you can see from today's event, putting more emphasis on data and quantitative analysis can really help enrich our understanding of not just the Great Divergence, but on other topics that are of interest to us. So I want to thank my colleague, Professor Debin Ma, for also doing such a wonderful job. Okay, so So we have, we're going to go back to our normal schedule of having our webinar events on Thursdays. So for next week, we plan to have a follow-up event by a colleague from Europe. Okay, so try to pay attention to our website and our email messages to sign up for our future webinar events. So again, thanks going to our participants today and our speaker today and discussants for making this event very interesting and a very good learning experience. Okay, so that's it from us in Hong Kong.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. Goodbye.